This is Plymouth Hoe, with its Georgian buildings, and behind me, the Naval Memorial. Just to the right of those is Drake's statue and the Armada Memorial. Plymouth Sound is where Drake set sail from to defeat the Armada. But when Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, the Royal Navy was almost non-existent, and it was largely thanks to the efforts and enterprise of John Hawkins that new ships were built for the trade and the defence of the realm. Hawkins reintroduced into England a spirit of buccaneering adventure and enterprise, which others joined in with in their search for the passage to the Spice Islands. In Europe, the two dominating powers at the beginning of the 16th century were Spain and Portugal. And with the discovery of the new lands, a treaty formalised by the Pope decided that Spain would have all of the lands west of a line about 47 degrees west of Greenwich, and everything east of that would belong to Portugal. The rest of the European powers were excluded, and they took no notice of it anyway, especially England. Portugal found that they'd overextended their resources, and their empire finished with the formation of Brazil. But for Spain, it was a very different matter. Spain's coffers were being enriched by the gold and silver that the Spanish galleons were bringing back unhindered and unguarded. In 1562, John Hawkins began to trade with the Spaniards, and he was joined 4 years later by a young Francis Drake. Drake very soon showed a flair for adventure when he captured a mule train overflowing with gold and silver, which he brought back and presented to the Queen. And that led to a much more daring plan, to go round to the west coast of South America with a fleet of 5 ships, where the pickings would be easier and much bigger. There were Spanish warships defending the Caribbean, but none in the Pacific Ocean. One of the major challenges, which Drake didn't explain to his crews, because in those days ordinary sailors still thought the earth was flat, that they wouldn't be able to go back round Cape Horn because of the weather and the Spanish waiting for them, so they would have to sail westwards, completely round the world, and they'd visit the Spice Islands on their way home. It was a bold plan, and secrecy was essential, so Drake told his crews that they were going to be going to the Mediterranean. And here in Brixham Harbour there's a replica of the ship, the Golden Hind, that Francis Drake used to sail all the way around the world between 1577 and 1580. It's a remarkable achievement looking at the size of this vessel. Drake's project was a complete success, and Drake was knighted by Queen Elizabeth on the deck of the Golden Hind, and his ship put in dry dock on public display on his return to London. There's another modern replica there on the South Bank now, but the trip had taken a long time. And looking at the enforced pace of these yachts in full sail perhaps gives us an idea of the pace of life for Drake and his compatriots in those days. Meanwhile, a furious King of Spain was busy building his armada. William Cecil, Francis Walsingham, and Francis Drake all knew that it was being assembled in Cadiz harbour, and after Mary Queen of Scots was executed early in 1587, Drake sailed round to Cadiz and sent in his famous fire ships, singeing the King of Spain's beard and delaying the sailing of the Armada. Philip had to have enough ships to be able to collect his troops from the Netherlands. England needed time to prepare her army, although the navy was ready. English ships were smaller and far more manoeuvrable than the Spanish galleons, thanks largely to John Hawkins' design and the Huguenot sailmakers who'd moved to England Drake and Frobisher were captains as part of the main fleet in Plymouth, while a detachment was kept in the Thames, in reserve, in case the Spanish army did board the ships and were able to cross the Channel. This is the English flagship, the Ark Royal, and the admiral of the fleet was the Lord Howard of Effingham. Not an easy job when you have brilliant but maverick captains like Francis Drake and Martin Forbisher under your command. Walsingham's intelligence told Drake that the Spanish fleet had come round to Corunna. They were on their way. But when the Armada arrived in the Channel, Drake was playing bowls. Because the tide was coming in, it was the middle of the day, the wind was blowing onshore, and the sailing ships of the English Navy had returned to port to restock after patrolling the Bay of Biscay. They were caught napping. The Spanish Armada could sail up to the harbour entrance and blow them all out of the water, in the same way that Drake had done in Cadiz a year earlier. But instead, watched by Drake in disbelief, Medina Sidonia, the commander of the Spanish fleet, sailed on by. With his game of bowls unfinished, Drake turned to his colleagues and said, "Well, gentlemen, we may as well finish our game. There's no point in hoisting the sails and weighing anchor yet." In the later afternoon, when the tide had turned and the wind was favourable, Drake was able to take his fleet out of the Sound and shadow the Spanish Armada up the Channel to prevent any of them from landing to get a beachhead. There were skirmishes outside Plymouth, Portland, and the Isle of Wight. There were no landings, and by evening, as this contemporary map shows, they had reached their objective and dropped anchor at Gravelines in the Netherlands. The English ships had now exhausted their stock of cannonballs. They had no more ammunition. Despite Drake's realizing the situation and appropriating the stock of cannonballs from one of the stricken Spanish vessels on the way up the Channel, the admiral of the fleet had a problem. There was nothing now preventing the Spanish soldiers boarding the ships the following day. "Simple," said Drake. "Let's make sure there's no ships for them to board." Exactly as he had done a year before in Cadiz, seeing how tightly packed the Spanish were at anchor, selecting some of the older, drier, almost worn-out ships, Drake set fire to them and sailed them straight into the heart of the Spanish fleet. The Spaniards had seen it all before, and it caused even more chaos. Those that could cut their anchor cables and headed out up the east coast of England, hotly chased by the English fleet, who had nothing to fire at them other than the arrows which the archers on board had brought with them. It was a resounding victory. Of the Spanish ships who sailed out of Gravelines, only about half of them managed to navigate the treacherous Irish waters to make it back to Spain to tell Philip II that his dream of conquering England and returning it to the Catholic faith was firmly at an end. As the Queen of England said, "He blew with his winds and they were scattered." And Philip II finally accepted that it wasn't God's will, that England should be forcibly returned to the Catholic faith and the jurisdiction of the Holy Roman Empire. The Church of England and the realm of Queen Elizabeth were safe. Beacons were lit at the top of every hill to pass the word around a joyful kingdom, and the victory over the Spanish Armada has continued to be celebrated ever since, as a beacon of inspiration and determination to stand for the freedom under law of the individual and the nation of the United Kingdom.